So we're very grateful that at this extremely poignant moment and this, really critical juncture, that we have the capacity and the ability to be together and to listen and to learn and to kind of better understand what's happening and to think about how we as American Jews can connect and relate to what's happening and going on there. So I want to thank Lab Shul and West End Synagogue for co-sponsoring this program this evening with us. I'll do a little bit of introductions and then I'm going to be in conversation with Elisheva. So today we are talking about threats and resistance, what's happening in Israel. When we created this program like 2 or 3 weeks ago, we knew there was this potential of a judicial overhaul. We knew that this right-wing, government had, the ultra-nationalist government had been formed, but we had no idea how these events would unfold. And the very fact that, we're sitting here right now after the events of this week, it could not be more timely. So I'm sitting here with Elisheva Goldberg, who is the Senior Director of Media and Policy for the New Israel Fund, a contributing writer for Jewish Currents magazine. She previously worked as the Chief of Staff for former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, as a researcher for the progressive Israeli think tank Molad. She lives in New York with her husband and 3 kids. We had Elisheva come and speak with us during the pandemic at the last election, when we were wondering what was happening there. And she was so helpful and brilliant that we knew exactly who to go to in this moment. And Elisheva works for the New Israel Fund, which is a US-based nonprofit NGO established in 1979, which its objective is social justice and equality for all Israelis. So I think with that, we will spotlight the two of us. Great. And begin the conversation. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We have muted everyone and we'll stay muted. And we also have, it should be that you can chat with me when it comes to the Q&A section of the evening. But I believe that is, I think the chat is available, but if you can, for when we get to the Q&A and you have questions you'd like asked, please send them to me directly. All right. So Elisheva, welcome. Thank you so much. We know this must be such a hard and difficult time and also an inspiring time for New Israel Fund and everyone working there. And as I mentioned, since we scheduled this session a few weeks ago, so much has changed, especially in the last 48 hours. So for those of us who aren't following the minute by minute or, kind of having a hard time catching up with all of the events happening so fast, I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of a catch up as to what's happening right now on the ground in Israel regarding the coalition and this potential judicial overhaul.
Sure. First of all, let me say to all of you and to you, Rabbi, thank you so much for having me. It's truly a pleasure. It has always been a pleasure to speak with the SAJ audience and others, and as well as your co-sponsors, very close to our political and religious hearts. A Judaism that stands for all is certainly something that we believe in. So it's very lovely to be with you. It is really difficult to follow what is going on in Israel right now because it is unprecedented. This is a moment that is truly like no other, and we'll discuss a lot of what that's about. But I'll just step back one moment and say broadly, and then I'll speak about the last 48 hours, and then I'll speak about last week, because those are 3 different things. Broadly, what is happening now, some people are calling a judicial coup, some people are calling it a judicial revolution, and some people are calling it regime change. It sort of depends on what your politics are. But really just sort of brass tacks, what's happening is that Netanyahu and his far right, like furthest right we've ever seen, populist government has, from the very get-go of their the installation of this government, has been pushing a kind of blitz of legislation. The blitz has included a lot of anti-democratic laws that aren't about the judiciary, but the ones about the judiciary are what the protests are about. So what these pieces of legislation would collectively do would to turn the Israeli government or the Israeli government system writ large into a kind of single branch of government, with no checks and balances. One of the challenges of Israel and the system in general is that it only has two branches of government. There's only the judiciary and the Knesset / government, which are actually one body. It's unicameral. It's not like in America where we have, Congress, which is made up of two houses, and then you have the executive, and then you have the judiciary. No, this is basically the government and a very weak Knesset, which is supposed to be a check, but doesn't really function as a check, and the judiciary. So what they want to do is kneecap the judiciary. They want to undermine the power of the judiciary in various ways, and capture the legal advisors of the government, of the ministries, which would basically let the majoritarian will rule. And that's actually what they're calling democracy. They're calling majoritarianism democracy. They're basically saying, we are the elected government, and therefore we win. We rule everything. And that's actually just not how democracy works. We all know that democracy is a system of checks and balances. It's a system of government that protects minority rights. And that is what they would like to see go by the wayside. And a lot of Israelis are afraid of this for various reasons. Some are afraid that these ultranationalists and the conservative elements of the government will eliminate the basic rights for women, for LGBTQ people. This is a government that is both ultranationalist in terms of and expansionist in terms of its sense of the occupied territories, but also very ultra-Orthodox. And so people are worried about basically the rights of anybody who isn't a person represented in the government, which is a reasonable fear. So I'll talk about, what a little bit more about that in a minute, but I just want to turn to the last 48 hours and then to the last week. So there was a mini diplomatic crisis yesterday and today between the US and Israel. The US is trying to downplay that right now, but basically what happened was the ambassador to Israel, Ambassador Nides, was kind of being chummy and said, yeah, we'd love to see Netanyahu in the White House soon. And then on the tarmac, at some point, President Biden said, when asked, is Prime Minister Netanyahu invited to the White House, he very clearly said, no, not in the near term. Those were his words. So there was some daylight between, different elements of the American government, but also it caused quite a stir in Israel, where Israelis were seeing this and saying, oh, Netanyahu, who has claimed for much of his career to be kind of like the America whisperer, really is distancing us from our closest ally and critical security partner. So that's what happened the last 48 hours. Now, this last week, to give you just one more kind of a middle ground here, Yoav Gallant, who is the defense minister and the Likudnik in Netanyahu's party, announced that he would not vote for the piece of legislation that they're trying to push through now, which is actually specifically about the way that Supreme Court justices are appointed. He said he would not vote for it. Why did he say that? Because what he saw was reservists from the Air Force, reservists from the intelligence units, saying to him and to his buddies who are generals, we will not serve if this is what it looks like for our country. If our country does not look like a democracy, we won't serve in the army. And the Israeli army is quite dependent on these particular reservists. The Air Force really in particular depends on reservists. And Gallant saw this and he said, well, what's happening is actually harming Israeli security. And so I can't lend my hand to it. And he was summarily fired by Bibi. And for a lot of people, that was a powerful red line. And it brought not just the masses and tens and hundreds of thousands that we've seen over the last 2 months, 3 months into the streets, but like everybody. It brought the institutions that were kind of waiting to see, the Histadrut, the labor union. It brought which ultimately means a lot of things. It meant that the Ben Gurion airport was shut down. It meant that malls were shut down. It meant that a lot of things, the academic institutions decided to go on strike. And so all of the schools were closed. There were these massive demonstrations of teachers. Teachers brought their chairs and tables out into the streets. So it was just the country shut down. And that said to Netanyahu, okay, the people, what I would say is the people have spoken. This can't continue. And Bibi heard it and he said, okay, I will pause this legislation until the summer session. I will pause it for now. The current session of the Knesset ends on April 2nd. And then there will be a break until the summer. And he's like, okay, let's cool our heels. Let's wait a minute. And let's see what happens. But in order to do that, it did come at a price. In order to keep his coalition together with the very, very, very far right partners that he had to promise, and whether or not this is an empty promise is anybody's guess, he had to promise essentially a private National Guard, which is what we're calling a militia, to the furthest right Kahanist member of his coalition, to Itamar Ben-Gvir. He had to say to him, you will have what you've always dreamed of, which is people who can enforcers that will protect your political interests and desires. So that's a very scary thing that he's sort of put in play at this moment, but it is yet to be seen, A, whether it will happen, because promises in politics are never to be trusted, and B, what the restraints of that will be, or what will be. But it is also very, very, very scary. And I don't want to restrain us too much from being scared, because so much has happened that we did not expect would happen in the last couple of months, that this could very well happen. This very well could actually take place. And that would be really scary, especially for Palestinian citizens of Israel. So I'll pause there, because I've already spoken for quite some time and given you a few different layers of what's going on.
No, it's extremely helpful, all of the context. And I have to confess to not being fully up to date with the Gvir, and I'd love to come back to that at some point and learn a little bit more about just this particular piece of what this promise. So I just want to take us back a little bit. I think a lot of us in America, obviously with Trumpism, I mean, we've seen all these trends, right, of moving towards the right and moving towards more populist, nationalist governments. But I think many of us were still really shocked when this election happened, when people like Gvir, Smotrich are ministers. They're not just, they're non-powerful players. They're actually in high positions of leadership and authority that are treasured in the Israeli society. And what does that mean? And so I think it would be really helpful if you could help us as American Jews understand how we got here. How because I guess the question is also were Israelis as surprised as I was, right? Were we just not in the know of the trends, or was this something that had been coming over time that people could have seen or spotted more quickly? So I'd love to just take us back into how we got to this.
Yeah, these are both good questions, and I'll just separate them for a second. One is kind of how we got here, and the other is how surprised should we be, or why were we so surprised, right? So how we got here, just a few more steps back, right? Before this current election that elected this government, which has 64, so the Knesset is 120 members. It has a 64 member majority, which in the last number of years is actually a very strong majority for the Knesset. Surprisingly, it's not a unity government in the sense that a unity government would hopefully span some of the left, some of the right, and some of the center, and that would give you maybe 70 Knesset members, or at least in theory. This is a small majority of the Knesset members. Now, how did this happen? First of all, remember that there have been 5 elections in Israel in the last 2 or 3 years, depending on how. I actually can't remember, but it's like a very short amount of time, a lot of elections, and there was a profound deadlock between the two camps, and the two camps have been in the last 2 or 3 years: yes, Bibi, no, Bibi. And this is, I will just also say and interject a point that I think is important and that I can come back to, but that I think that now is a profoundly interesting and potentially inspiring moment, in the sense that alignment of the pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi is breaking down, and it is becoming pro-democracy, and what they would call pro-democracy, but what we would call majoritarian populism or dictatorship of the few, depending on how you would like to phrase that. So the camps are sort of shifting potentially, and there's a potential for a realignment in a way that I have not seen or have not even read about in the history of Israel at this moment. So that's interesting and important. But remember, this was a deadlock. yes, Bibi, no, Bibi. And he could not. Bibi had the majority, but he could not form a coalition. He was having trouble making a government. And so in the last round of elections that formed a government, Bibi was not a part of it. They finally had this weird coalition of 8 parties, which included a Islamist conservative party, Naftali Bennett's religious Zionist party, Yamina, and like the centrists. And Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett were supposed to be alternative prime ministers. And that government lasted 1 year. It was called the Government of Change. And the whole point was that we're not going to deal with issues that actually might make us a little bit touchy, like the Palestinians. We are going to only deal with issues that are, have to do with real governance and real, sort of people's lives, Israeli citizens' day-to-day lives. Like we want to get a budget passed, which they hadn't had for years at that point. So they were kind of like a practical get-em government. The thing that cracked that government was, at the end of the day, the Palestinian issue. Because if you'll recall, what happened was this is a little bit in the weeds, so see if you can follow me. There is an emergency regulation that passes every 5 years in Israel to maintain what is essentially a dual system of government in the West Bank, right? In the West Bank, you have Palestinians who live under military rule, and you have Israelis who live under the civilian authority of Israel, right? So these are 2 different authorities. And in the West Bank, I would call that an apartheid system, right? You have 2 different laws for 2 different sets of ethnic identities, religious identities, or national identities. The emergency regulations that need to be passed every 5 years were not passing in that government because the government was so diverse and so complicated. And as a result, before they expired, what would have happened, what would have happened if they had not passed would have been that the settlers, the Israelis who live in the West Bank, would have become like the Palestinians in the sense that they would have no longer the privileges and the legal status that they have right now. They would have stopped having all of that, and it would have been complete chaos for the system. And so Naftali Bennett, in order to prevent that from happening, dissolved the government in advance. So ultimately, what came to bite this government of change, this broad coalition, was the fact that Israelis cannot agree on what to do with the occupied territories. And then we had this election. And in this election, the right was prepared. Bibi had had time to gather his troops. He had had time to strategize. And he made sure that not a single vote was wasted on the right, that the right people were running in lists together so that they would have blocks, so that they wouldn't lose votes. And the only reason that and on the left, things were very fractured. Things were very, very fractured, and there were a lot of votes lost. So in some sense, this is a unique government for Benjamin Netanyahu. It's a unique government for the far right, because somebody like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich couldn't have dreamed of the power that they have right now unless the circumstances of the last 3 years, the last 5 election cycles, could have brought us here. This is an incredibly strange situation, and incredibly is I'm maybe exaggerating a little bit. It's a strange situation in the sense that they have more power. They have an outsized amount of power right now. And when Bibi saw who he had and who he had finagled into the Knesset, he knew that he would have to give up a lot of that's my baby. He would have to give up a lot of you have to give out a lot of power. And so this government is a little different than most Bibi governments because Bibi usually is the master of the ship. He runs the show and tells his ministers what to do. Right now, it's a little bit of the case of the tail wagging the dog. He is being forced to do things that he otherwise might not want to do for the first time probably in his political career. Bibi traditionally, in his statements from, 10 years ago, was a strong supporter of an independent judiciary. This is a man who has said those words, that a strong and independent judiciary is critical to a democracy. And right now what he's doing is allowing his far-right government partners to destroy and gut that independent judiciary. But the people, the masses of Israelis who are out on the streets right now are trying to not let him. So that's where we are. Now, there's another question of...
Can I just add to that really quick before we go on? It's like, why did he need those? Were there other people? Like, why did it have to go to such extremes if he had the year to kind of get his troops in order? Why did he go to the most? I mean, you could imagine, as you said, he's had followers before that have been sort of still pro-democratic, right? So what made him go to that extreme to find the people to be in his government?
So that's a great question. And it comes down to politics in some sense. So you remember how I said that the alignment before like this moment was Bibi, anti-Bibi? So it was like that, and there was a breakaway party that was like the kind of Likud without Bibi version. There were, which basically said we won't sit with Bibi. So like that's the kind of, you know, like right wing but liberal in the sense of what we want to see from a democracy faction that broke away from him and left him with his kind of like crazy populist cohort inside the Likud. That's one. And two, you know, he tried to make a coalition with Benny Gantz. And Benny Gantz, who's this kind of, you know, this general, this quote unquote centrist figurehead, got burned. Bibi never gave him what he promised him, and that never really panned out. And so everybody who tried to work with him, who is like what I would call center right, has been burned, and just this time around was like, we're not doing that again. And that's part of what the deadlock has been. We're not sitting with Bibi. This man is toxic. I also should just say one incredibly important piece of context is that he is under indictment for 3 charges: for corruption, bribery, and breach of trust. This is a man that is out to save his own political skin and not out for the good of the country, right? So, and his political allies, like the people who are actually closer to him, let's say, you know, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, see that, and they don't want to have any part of it. So that's why, you know, and so the question of whether or not we should be surprised is actually, I think, a very difficult one to ask. I'll give another bit of context here, which is that I think mostly yes, but that's only because we are kind of living in a consistently surprising time. Right? Every single election that didn't go through, everyone was like, what's happening? Like something is broken in the system there. And, you know, what it takes to rebuild that, you know, is a very good question. Part of what the New Israel Fund invests in is infrastructure for long-term democratic systems building. So this is not something that can be turned on overnight. You can't fix the system that's very, very broken tomorrow. But, you know, it's a long-term, what people call a marathon, not a sprint, right? This is a long-term process. But in terms of surprising, I think your surprise in some sense depends on where you sit on the political map. If you're sitting on the right and you're seeing the things that these people that the far right government is doing, you're not surprised, because the things that they're doing now are things that they have said they would do if they had the chance, and now they have the chance. Things like deporting and allowing the execution for people convicted of terrorism. Things like repealing the disengagement law from 2005, which prevents Israelis from physically being in certain parts of the West Bank and certain settlements that were evacuated in 2005 alongside the Gaza Strip settlements. So they are doing what they said they would do. It's just shocking because it feels very extreme, and it is. So, and I also will say that there has been a lot of, over the years, there has been resentment that has built up amongst the ultra-Orthodox and amongst the religious Zionist communities about the Supreme Court specifically. Now, if you ask me, the Supreme Court is not any friend of the Palestinians. It has not done them any favors when it comes to land rights in Israel, and it certainly does not intervene for the most part when it comes to settlement construction that isn't on private Palestinian land. But this issue of private Palestinian land is actually where the settler right takes them to task. So one more piece of history. In 1979, the Supreme Court made a landmark ruling about the settlement, the territories. It said, we as Israel can call territory state land. And if we call that territory state land, Israelis can settle there. But if the territory is clearly Palestinian private property, they have a deed, they have some kind of identification showing that they own that land, Israelis cannot legally, according to Israeli law, settle on that land. And if they do, their homes must be destroyed and they must be evicted. And this ruling is called the Elon Moreh decision. And the settler community holds it against the Supreme Court to this day. And so what they want to do is, again, kneecap the Supreme Court so that they can get the whole land of Israel that they so desire and that they have so desired since 1967 and before. So that's part of what's at play here. The ultra-Orthodox community, and it is true that the Supreme Court, we think of the Supreme Court as a bastion of individual rights, of civil liberties, and it is a bastion of civil liberties for some. But if you ask the ultra-Orthodox, they will say that it is not a bastion of civil liberties for them. It protects the rights of LGBTQ people. It protects the rights of women, and it sometimes protects the rights of other minorities. But if you are ultra-Orthodox, you cannot have a segregated bus the way you want. You can't have, you can't prevent buses from running on Shabbat, although that's still actually that question is still up in the air. You can't do certain things that align with what you would call your lifestyle, right? And so they have held on to this feeling of the Supreme Court is not for us. The Supreme Court is for the Ashkenazi elite, and that is a feeling, and it's not entirely wrong, that they have had for a very, very long time. And so what this coalition of ultra-Orthodox and religious Zionist settler movement folks are trying to do is get back at the Supreme Court for these years of what they feel like is neglect of their rights and their political desires. So that's also just a kind of like very deep context to what's happening and why they are specifically aiming their sights at the Supreme Court.
And that's extremely helpful. I mean, I think most of us know that the ultra-right religious, community in Israel wants those kinds of things and are not, pro the same kinds of gender rights and LGBTQ rights as everyone else, but have not felt like they've been in positions of power to be able to exercise that. And I think the irony you pointed out was so helpful in that everyone leaving Bibi as a principled stance, but then leaves him with, what is that, politics makes the bedfellow, the bedfellows comment. So I think it's really complex, and I really appreciate you breaking it down. There was a request for you to speak a little slower, and I also speak fast, so I'm also acknowledging that I may be doing that as well. So I just want to move us on to a different question, a different approach, which is, while this moment that we're witnessing is very frightening, and frightening also in terms of the law of return, in terms of the role of non-Orthodox Jews, it affects us directly, right, in terms of what the consequences of this could be, as well as indirectly. We've also seen protests on a scale and on a sustained scale that is, to me, extraordinarily inspiring. And I wrote to the congregation earlier in the week, and I said, like, imagine that, an anti-democratic move happened in the States and then the entire country stopped, the fact that you could take a country and bring it to a halt is something that I think the United States, we can learn from, right? And we can be inspired by. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the protests and, not just the last 48 hours, but from the beginning. And I know a lot of Israelis are out every single Saturday night and multiple times a week. And, who are they? Who are, sort of the core? Who are people we're surprised that are part of it? Is it organized? Is it spontaneous? So just kind of like help us understand this, I think, more positive, or at least, inspiring aspect of what's happening.
So sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely. So this is there's a lot to talk about with the protests. The first thing that I'll say is that last Sunday, when the country was shut down, that was fully spontaneous. Everybody was just pouring into the streets. This, again, felt like a red line had been crossed for people who you might not otherwise see protesting, for the center and for the right, who, just anecdotally, I was having a conversation with somebody who I very much disagree with politically, but he said, I was pro the judicial reforms, But when Gallant was fired, I turned on Bibi. I just couldn't see that as a sound decision. It doesn't make any sense to me. Yoav Gallant is one of the last people who are in the Likud who kind of have their head on straight, just in terms of like what the traditional Likud has looked like. And he's a general, and he's the defense minister, and he's saying, you need to hold your horses, Bibi. And to fire him seems like a kind of insane choice. And so that really spontaneously, I think, the country really erupted around the country in a way that it hadn't before. I heard it said that the equivalent in America, it would have been as though 10 million people in America were protesting. If you can just imagine, city streets full, and across the country. We're talking about also small towns. The town of Karkur was protesting, in addition to Haifa and Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. This was really, really, really big. And I've also seen polling on this of who is out there. And, the left is out there. There are some leftists who are like, especially, I would say, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who don't see themselves in this protest. Palestinian citizens of Israel will often say, Israel was never a democracy for us. This isn't a country that we need to protect, where we need to protect its democracy, because it never functioned that way on our behalf. And so we're not going to protest. But there are people who are trying to bridge the gap between those people and the sort of center left that's been out there, protesting since the beginning. The first protests were organized by one of NIF's darling grantees, called Omdim B'Yachad, Standing Together, which is an organization that is both Palestinian and Jewish Israeli led. And they're really incredible. If you're not following their work, I really, really recommend it. And since then, the protests did grow, I think, spontaneously. Like the high-tech sector and the economists joined pretty soon. And they all said, if we pass these regulations, if we pass this judicial overhaul, or what we would call regime change, because it would make one branch of government instead of two, people are going to leave. There's going to be brain drain. We can't stay here if we're in an illiberal democracy. The same way that we saw brain drain in Poland and in Hungary, we're going to see it here. And it's not going to be good for what is essentially the cash cow of the Israeli economy, which is the high-tech sector. So they were kind of like the first big section of Israeli society to come out and say, this is bad. And then since then, we've seen the real, I think the most surprising and interesting has been the reservists. You've seen people say, I'm not going to show up for duty. And this is the first time that kind of civil disobedience has been threatened by, as far as I know, in the history of the state, at this level. And so I think that's just really, really interesting. Yeah, there are now protests. So now that it's been paused, I think the idea that the strategy, if you can imagine Bibi Netanyahu's thinking, is, okay, let them calm down. Let's have Pesach. Let's get through Ramadan. Let's go, let's have everybody calm down, and then we'll just slowly push it through afterwards, or not. He might want to put this away, because his ultimate goal is to save his own skin. And if putting it away will do that, then maybe he'll do that. But it would break up his coalition, I think, if he did. So he's kind of caught between a bit of a rock and a hard place. But so the protests may simmer down, but I don't think that the people who are out there and who have been out there for weeks and weeks and weeks, and who go out every single Saturday night, are buying what he's selling. I think that either as soon as this legislation comes back onto the table, or even before, we're going to see more protests. I don't think this is going to be over because he said pause. And even now, Omdim B'Yachad and others are organizing anti-Ben Gvir's militia protests specifically about this particular issue that we were talking about before. So, protests are not over, not by any stretch, but they are, and they have been very diffuse. It really is important to say that this has been a very kind of the building of the infrastructure of these protests has happened spontaneously. So, you have WhatsApp groups, and you have people who see each other every Saturday night, and you have a certain kind of camaraderie that's grown up in the last two months. And I think that that's a powerful tool going forward against this government.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to take a few questions that are coming in. There's only 2 or 3, so please keep sending them to the Q&A. One question is a little just kind of in terms of background and understanding the situation. How are the Israeli Supreme Court justices named? Which is a really important question. Are they elected? Are they named? Who does that? What's their term limits? Like, how does it differ from our Supreme Court? And also, how would that change under the reform legislation? Like, I guess it would really abolish it would basically give, well, you'll do it better than I will.
Yeah.
So, please.
Okay, so this is a good question. So in the US, this process is politicized, right? It is an appointment that is proposed by the executive and then ratified by the legislative. That's how it works to get somebody onto the third branch of government, the judiciary. It's not a great system, but I will also just say that we as human beings who want to live in democracy have not figured this one out. This is a very challenging thing. Who can we appoint over us, right? Because these are not elected officials, and they're not elected in any democracy. They're appointed. So it's actually a challenging thing for somebody who, especially somebody who thinks about democracy in very stark black and white terms of like elections. So I think the Israeli society is sort of undergoing right now a collective civics lesson, which is also a very important thing, that democracy is not just elections. It is also a system of balances and checks and balances. But the system right now in Israel is that there's a committee. There's a committee that's headed by the justice minister. So that's somebody from the government. And it contains Supreme Court justices that are sitting justices, usually the chief justice and a number of others. It contains the head of the Israeli Bar Association. It contains members of the coalition, so the governing body, and it contains members of the opposition. That's what it looks like. And right now, the majority of the votes go to the professionals. They go to the justices that are sitting, and they go to with the Israeli Bar Association representative. So they have what Bibi Netanyahu calls a system where a friend brings a friend. They bring people who they know from the system who are experts, because they are the experts, and they bring the experts. And that's the system that they're saying that doesn't work. We don't think that that's fair. We think that that's elitist. We think that that's biased. We need a different system. Now, there have been a bunch of different versions of what this committee could look like that have been proposed in the last number of years. But what is being proposed now is to take out the Israeli Bar Association person and give a majority to the governing coalition, which would essentially mean that the governing body, that the government, right, the coalition, Bibi Netanyahu's government, right now a far right-wing government would get to handpick justices to sit on the Supreme Court. In other words, that's just full capture of the judiciary by the legislative and by the executive, which in Israel are one, right? So that's what they're fighting over. They're fighting, do the professionals, the legal professionals and the judges have the majority on this committee, or do the politicians, do the governing politicians, do the far right politicians, the ones who were elected, right? The people's voice should be the one to rule, also in the case of the judiciary. And that's the argument that's taking place right now in Israel. Does that answer the full question?
I wasn't the person who asked. I'm doing the Q&A, but I think it does. I think it's helpful. Someone mentioned the UK system and how that works. I don't know if you know anything about the UK system, but anyway, so that's okay. So many more questions. I'm going to keep going. I wanted to bring up, okay, where to go? You know, I think maybe you've touched on this already, but if this were to go through, like, if the country hadn't come to a halt, right, and everything hadn't happened, or if it were to go through in after the pause, what does that exactly look like? That's the question. Is please describe the means by which the proposed legislation will hobble the Supreme Court and bring it under government control. Maybe you've done that already. Is there anything to add on that?
Well, yeah, there's so the proposed package of legislation, I've only mentioned the one piece of legislation they've been trying to push through now, which is the committee to appoint Supreme Court justices. But there are other pieces of legislation that also hobble the independence of the judiciary. One of the key ones that is a little bit in the weeds is about Knesset legal advisors. So the ministries in Israel, right? So like imagine, you know, the Department of Defense has its own legal advisor, right? Department of Defense has a legal advisor who is an independent party, who is a professional, who is appointed by the professionals in the legal department and not by the person who is appointed to be the head of the ministry of the defense ministry. In Israel, it's a little bit different because you also have to remember that the ministers, once you form a government, once you have an election and you have people who need to form a coalition, the way that coalition gets formed is through horse trading. So you have politicians like Miri Regev, let's say, who's currently heading the Department of Transportation, but she is not a person who knows anything about transportation. This is not a professional. This is a politician first and foremost for like in every way, right? This is not about her getting stuff done. This is about her having a position where she can say things ultimately, and where she can make changes that she can show her constituents that she's a good politician. So that's important because the politicians run the ministries, right? Politicians. What they want in this legislative package is for those politicians, the ministers themselves, to be able to hire their legal advisor. Now, imagine that. That's like hiring, you know, there was a funny cartoon that was running around the internet today of a kid who decided that in order to get what he wanted for lunch at school was going to run for president of the school, and then he was going to replace the principal with his own mother. So this is the idea, that you essentially capture the legal advisory system so that there is no check on whatever it is that minister wants to do. That's actually a very important check that's under talked about, basically, because it's everything that doesn't get to the Supreme Court, right? If those things were to pass through, if a lot of things that the ministers wanted to do weren't stopped by their legal advisors, that would be they would do things that were illegal, and the Supreme Court would say, hey, you did something that's illegal, we have to stop you. And that would put every single minister in conflict all the time with the Supreme Court and just like sort of exacerbate the situation. The other thing that's really important, that's different, and it's also why there's so much fighting about the Supreme Court, is that the Supreme Court in Israel intervenes in administrative tasks that the government undertakes. So this is a little bit different than in the US. So the government announces that it needs that it's going to evacuate a settlement because it's on private Palestinian land, and that's illegal. But it doesn't. And so what happens? Who steps in, right? The court says, you need to evacuate that settlement. Why aren't you evacuating that settlement? And that's when you see, the politicians being like, the Supreme Court is the thing that's actually, holding the government accountable in a way that we don't want. So that's another kind of like aspect here. So there, I've now talked about a couple of pieces of background, two pieces of legislation that they wanted to pass. One is about the Judicial Appointments Committee, and one is about the legal advisors, but there's a third that is critical, and I cannot miss it. And it has been around and talked about since 2012 at least, which is what's called the override clause. And what this would do would be a piece of legislation that said, if the Knesset, the government, passes a law and the Supreme Court uses its power of judicial review to knock down that law and say this law is essentially unconstitutional, even though Israel doesn't have a constitution, this law does not work for the basic laws of Israel, the government could reinstate that law and override the decision of the Supreme Court, which, clearly just says the Supreme Court, you are not, your opinion doesn't matter. Your decisions are moot. We can do whatever we want as the representative of the sovereign people of Israel. So those are a few ways that, this package of legislation is trying to really cut down and undermine and overthrow the Supreme Court.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. It's very frightening, and we appreciate your helping us understand it. Someone asked about Ashkenazi Sephardic tensions in any of this. We haven't addressed that at all. Is there an issue with underrepresentation of Sephardim on the Supreme Court? And is that part of, is there any way that divisions are happening along those lines, or anything you can illuminate about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's always an ethnic and class divide happening. I wrote a long article about the history of the Supreme Court, which I'm happy to share because it's a bit of a complicated story. But the truth is, the country, when it was founded to privilege Ashkenazi Jews. And that included the Supreme Court. The first justice minister is the one who decided how the Supreme Court would look. It is actually much more like the British system than anything else, because that's what was in place before, because there was a colonial government and they adopted a lot of their ways. But what happened was they appointed only Ashkenazim in the first instance. In fact, only German Jews, really. The vast majority of the Supreme Court justices in the initial instance were specifically German Jews. And it was only in 1962 that the first Sephardi Supreme Court justice was appointed, and he was a Greek. And the chair of the Sephardi Supreme Court justice became the Sephardi chair. In some sense, it was a tokenized position where they were giving representation, to the Orientals in that kind of way. It was definitely not a sharing of power. It was a tokenizing moment. But I will say that since then, and so there's like a memory of that is deeply embedded in the ways that the Mizrahi community relate to the Supreme Court. It's also important to say here that the Mizrahi community is divided in how it votes, and it often votes right, and it often votes with Shas, or many Mizrahi Jews vote for Shas because it is a traditionalist religious party. And Shas has some of the same gripes that the other ultra-Orthodox parties have towards the Supreme Court, that it doesn't actually respect their rights. But that aside, in the last couple of decades, the populist right has actually had a lot of power over the Supreme Court and over judicial appointments. So what's important here is that this is a kind of collective memory that doesn't hold as much water today as it once did. This kind of like ethnic divide, and this especially the sense that that everybody has that, this is a fire-breathing liberal body. So one more piece of history here. The 1990s is really, and the late 80s and early 90s is when the Supreme Court got this reputation, because Aaron Barak, who was then the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, enacted what was then known as the Judicial Revolution. And it's not by chance that the name of what's happening right now is also a judicial revolution, because in some sense it's a counter-revolution. It's an attempt to undo what Aaron Barak did. Now, Aaron Barak was an Ashkenazi Jew, and he was a kind of like, oh, excuse me, I have to get a charger. My computer is going to die. He enacted, he ratified a series of basic laws that instituted and formalized individual rights in Israel. The rights of minorities, the rights of LGBTQ, women, the sort of things that we talked about. And the high watermark for those civil liberties was the 1990s. But again, this is when the kind of resentment also grew in the 1990s. The resentment among the ultra-Orthodox, the resentment among the Mizrahi Orthodox, and also the resentment among the settler groups. Although those things had started before. I'll try and get to the point here, which is that in 2015, Ayelet Shaked was the justice minister. Ayelet Shaked, who was Naftali Bennett's, co-conspirator, and who was herself a populist in similar ways to what we're seeing now, like the Yariv Levins and the folks who are bringing forward this judicial revolution. And she started appointing judges to the lower courts, which was her prerogative. And she appointed conservatives. She appointed Mizrahim. She appointed a fair number of Arab judges as well, to certain Arab family courts. But she appointed in the realm of 300 judges to the system, and they were all what she would call, or what we would call, conservative, that is non-interventionalist. They don't do a lot of the things that you would want from a proactive court in order to protect civil liberties. And so since then, it's very hard to say that the court is actually a bastion of liberal interventionalism. And that's true across the board. It's true. And I guess I'll end there so that I don't continue to talk, but it's an important thing to say that, like, this moment feels like the right is finally getting the left is getting its comeuppance. If you're on the right, you're seeing the left get its comeuppance, but actually that started a decade ago. That started arguably even in 2009. So
that story of stacking the court sounds familiar in terms of parallels. Sadly familiar. I'm going to ask two more buckets of questions, and then we'll wrap up. There was a bunch of questions related to protests, and then elections, and possibly even new elections. So let me start with the first. So I'm just going to kind of lump a few questions about the protests together, and you can choose how you want to answer. One person asked about how the power of or impact of, of international protests. So the protests that are happening in the US, do they matter? And what is their impact, either in terms of our own government or with Bibi and in Israel? And then the other question was around the reservists and how powerful that was a block of people that really brought this to the front. And how was that organized? Was it spontaneous? And will that continue? And then the third, and again, you can choose whatever of this you want to answer, was about might this protest have a long-term positive effect on strengthening sort of more centrist, or at least pro-democracy centrist and progressive civil libertarians?
Yeah.
Just a small question.
So we have long-term effects of the protests, we have reservists and the impact, and we have,
I think, the international piece.
the international piece, right? So look, it's hard to know what has an impact and what doesn't. When these protests initially started, I had the thought, and I think it was the analysis that was shared by a lot of people, that, like, Bibi doesn't care about protests. He can protest from now, he can scream about it, he doesn't care. He can go ahead and do what he wants, he has the power. But I think that the reservists did show him that that's not entirely true. And I think that the country really has kind of come out and said no. And so that, it is pretty powerful. And I do think it will continue. I do think it will continue if this legislation continues. So I think that it's very much linked. I don't know about the long-term effects. I do think that there is something that is inspiring to me, which is that, NIF at the moment is helping to organize and helping the organizations that organize what we're calling the anti-occupation bloc inside of the protests. So that's a series of organizations, probably something like 20 or 30 organizations, that show up and do this linkage that I kind of was talking about at the beginning, which is that the streets of Tel Aviv are very much linked to the fate of the West Bank. That, we cannot talk about equality and democracy for all without thinking about what that actually means in the entire territory that Israel controls. And so I do think that there is a moment here. There's what I called yesterday. I said this yesterday, and I'll say it again today. I was on a podcast, which I can also send you all. I think it's the door. I don't think that Israelis have yet walked through the door to thinking about what they mean when they say equality for all and when they chant that. But I do think that if you say those words enough, you have to consider what it means that there are millions of people who live with no rights inside of the territory that you also live, 25 minutes from Tel Aviv. So I do think that that is a very powerful long-term effect. I also think that when we saw, there was a few weeks ago, there was a terror attack in the area of Hawara, the village of Hawara, which is a place that actually a lot of settlers have to travel through in order to get to the settlements that are in the northern West Bank. And settlers took revenge on this town by bringing hundreds of people to basically wreak havoc and create what we called then a pogrom. Like they just torched cars by the hundreds. They burned homes and threw rocks and broke windows. And the one man was killed, although not directly in Hawara. In any case, it was a massive event, and that really shook a lot of Israelis as well. And one thing that I saw that I was also inspired by is that at protests, when the police were, using some of the tactics that they use against Palestinians all the time, some of the like police brutality tactics, we're talking about water cannons, and we're talking about how do you say when they hit him, like exploding canisters and things like that. They started chanting to the police, "Where were you in Hawara?" In other words, why were you not protecting the innocent people who were there? And why are you now attacking us? Like, if you're here and we know that you have this force and this ability, this capability, why were you not protecting those people? And I think that to me was quite inspiring. And it wasn't once or twice, it was in a lot of places. And it's become a little bit of a refrain. The question about international protests. So the New Israel Fund, along with our partners at the Progressive Israel Network, organized a fair number. Well, we organized a letter that we had Jewish communal institutions sign, which I believe SAJ was on, when Bezalel Smotrich came to visit. This is not unique to the U.S. This also, the Board of Deputies in the UK did this when he came to visit a number of months ago over there, but when he was still just a member of the opposition and not what he is now, which is a minister in the government. But we organized a protest outside the place that he was speaking, and that made incredible headlines in Israel. I do think that there is a power to the kind of unified voice that especially American or international Jewry has, which is we don't believe that this is what should represent us. We don't think that this is what the state of Israel should look like. And should act like. Certainly not, somebody like Bezalel Smotrich, who has pronounced himself a proud homophobe, a proud fascist, a man who, asked that his wife be separated from, from Arab women in her maternity ward. I mean, a segregationist, essentially. This is not somebody who we can get behind and somebody who we will turn our backs on. I think that that's very, very important. And I think that that is a message, not just to Bibi Netanyahu, who, whether he hears it or not, I don't know, but to future governments. And in some sense, I see it as a kind of a long-term work to sort of have a voice in what is going on in Israel. So I think they're very, very valuable. Yes. Yes.
That's great. And it was, SAJ, we bring in speakers and we're very clear about civil rights, but we don't take political stands typically with Israel. And we made the decision to change our policy for this purpose, and because we knew how important it was. And
I think you're not unique in that sense. I think people were like, we don't usually take a stand because it's complicated and our constituents think different things. And, we're not actually voting members of this polity. And there's something to that also. But this is too much. This is a real red line that American Jews will stand up for. And I thought that was pretty amazing.
Exactly. And thank you for leading the charge. Okay, I'm going to squeeze in one more question before the final question. A question was raised about right-wing money from the US and how that has contributed to what's going on today, which really could be its own session. So I know that's a tough question. I also know Rabbi Jill Jacobs just wrote a really strong piece on that, and I can send that out with the materials that we send when we send the video. But if you want to speak to that for a moment, and then I'll.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot. So it's hard to, this is a very
a big one. Yeah.
I'll say that the thing that people have been focusing on was there was a piece in the New York Times about this. And it's been on Israelis' radar for a long time, but I think it's just finally reaching American shores. The Kohelet Forum is a think tank that models itself in some sense after the Federalist societies in the US. where their goal is to stack the courts. Their goal is to create a conservative milieu around certain key issues. In America, it's, you know, abortion and things like that, and in Israel, it's a whole range of things. It's less abortion, actually, but we can talk about that later. But the Kohelet Forum is funded by two American Jewish fellows, one named Jeffrey Yass and one named Arthur Danchik. And these guys have been anonymous for a long time, and they were actually exposed by some of NIF's grantees as the donors to this Kohelet Forum. And Kohelet has been the kind of guide, the intellectual guide for these pieces of legislation that we're talking about. Yariv Levin, who proposed this series of bills, he's currently the justice minister. He's a member of the Likud, and he's a longtime fan of Kohelet. And he thanked the Kohelet Forum, and specifically the head of the Kohelet Forum, Moshe Koppel, for kind of helping him formulate this legislation. So what is happening is American dark money, American Jewish dark money, is funding a think tank, which is intentionally gutting the kind of pillars of Israeli democracy. That's what's happening. And it is pretty amazing to think about in that way. These are guys, these are billionaires. These are men who made their money in various financial, market schemes. They have a lot to spare, and they like Sheldon Adelson and many others are not afraid to put a lot of money where their politics lie. And that's the other piece of this, which is that many settlements and many of the parts of the settlement enterprise have also been funded by American Jewish money, but that's a different story. Right now we're talking about the judicial revolution, and that's the one to look at, which is the Kohelet Policy Forum.
Okay, thank you for that. Wow. Okay, so I'm gonna ask this question by means of also sort of helping us a little bit think about what's next and closing with that. So it's kind of a two-part but connected. Is there any chance, do you think, and obviously you're not, you don't know the future, but in your estimation or NIF, is there any chance of a reasonable compromise? It doesn't sound like a compromise situation, but I don't know, maybe there is, because otherwise, again, we know Bibi will lose his coalition if he doesn't do something, right? So what might that look like as a compromise? Or is there a chance they might back down? And then the other side is, I think I had 4 or 5 or 6 questions connected to this fundamental idea of like, how do you get him out? Like, is there going to be an election? And is that really what needs to happen? Is that actually the goal in some ways? And it's Bibi in partnership, right? Because Bibi has been in other partnerships where it's not gone this far. So yeah, how does it look different in a future, and would an election be what's needed?
Yeah. This is a hard question.
First is really, is there any chance of a compromise? What might that look like? Or
I think analysts differ on this question. I think the president of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, formerly a member and head of the Labor Party, and son of the whatever, it doesn't matter. His credentials are not the point. The point is that he tried to convene the parties to create a compromise a couple of weeks ago, and it was a complete failure. He basically said, we need to enshrine individual and rights and civil liberties, and the government was like, we're not interested in anything that sort of like approaches what you're talking about. And they were very adamant. They're extremely adamant that this particular piece of legislation we're talking about the Judicial Appointments Committee, that be passed. And there is no compromise around that. It's either the politicians have the majority or they don't. And so, I don't know. I don't think that could happen. What I do think Bibi is aiming for, and has been his go-to tactic many times, is a spinning of the wheels. He wants to have negotiations. It reminds me a little bit of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, which is that we just have negotiations to have negotiations. We're not actually aiming at getting out of them with a solution that is good for everybody. There's like not a lot of good faith And the opposition has seen that. The opposition has said, there's no reason for us to try and compromise with you. You're not here to be in good faith. But there are, there's another round of talks now there. And again, like, it's funny because all of the language, not all of the language, some of the language is very reminiscent of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Hebrew. But they're going to try. They're going to try. And I truly cannot predict what will come out of it. But I think that there's a sticking point here, which is the Judicial Selections Committee. And I don't see any compromise there. How we get Bibi out, part of what I don't know how to do this analysis. That's the truth, because it's so unique. But part of what I kind of want to see is the protest movement continue to develop. It feels like it's not in its infancy anymore. It feels like it's like kind of a teenager, and a serious one, like not to be dismissed, but I want it to grow up a little more. I want it to develop its own language, its own infrastructure, because I do think that this realignment that I was talking about earlier, the potential for becoming not just pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi, but actually shifting and something giving in Israeli society and having a communal civics lesson might actually mean that in the next round of elections, we see something totally different. Right now, the polling is still with the old parties, with the old alignment, with the old versions of things. And I want us to get to a place far enough into this where those aren't what we're talking about anymore. But do I know if that's going to happen? I absolutely do not. I absolutely cannot predict that. Yeah.
So we're going to bring it to a close. Is there anything else you want to kind of leave us with? Or I guess I always like to leave on a note of hope. So where are you drawing hope in this moment, and anything that you might want to just leave us on a parting note of
yeah, I mean, here's my opportunity also to plug the New Israel Fund.
Yes.
I mean, really, this is an organization that is operationalizing for this moment. If there was a moment for the New Israel Fund to be alive and kicking, it's now. When you have all of the systems of democracy, all of what I consider like the pillars of democracy collapsing, what is left is civil society. And that is what we fund. We want to make a strong, powerful, empowered civil society that can organize and that can build the democratic infrastructure that we need for the future. And that's what we're doing. So we're reinvesting in democratic infrastructure. We are giving a ton of emergency grants to organizations that need them right now to make sure that they are protected, not just because their rights might be lost, but because there's legislation that's in the wings waiting to tax foreign funding, to basically try and undermine civil society, the final, the last bastion of democracy out there. I mean, there's also the media, which is its own complicated situation, but which is a pillar of democracy. But we are giving emergency grants, we are investing in democratic infrastructure, and we've created a kind of hub where what the New Israel Fund and what its action arm Shatil does really well is to organize the organizers. So we give skills and we give advice and we give strategic planning help to people who are trying to do the good work on the ground. So yeah, I mean, I am inspired daily by what I see from our grantees, and very, very impressed by the work that's being done, even as everything is really uncertain and shaky right now.
Thank you. And again, I never assume that everyone on the call has any one particular belief. It could be all over the place, but we all share. I believe, and the reason that we're here is feeling that Israel has to stay and be a place that is fundamentally democratic and upholds the basic human dignity of every person that lives there. And that is our goal to get there. And thank you for what NIF does to contribute significantly in significant ways. And NIF is an organization I have long supported and admired, and I'm grateful for all that you do to make that happen and to be there in this moment to to continue to build on this incredible work that's happening. So thank you so much, Elisheva. Everyone give a virtual, applause in this muted environment. And really, as you spoke last time to us a few years ago, we are so grateful, the depth of your knowledge, the incredible vastness of it, and also your ability to articulate it into ways that we can understand. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining tonight. This issue is ongoing, and we hope you can continue to find ways to engage and to learn and to support, especially as we see what will happen on the other side of Pesach and Ramadan. So thank you all. Have a good evening, and shalom and salam. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.